thank you very much for coming today. We have members from everywhere. We have over 150 registered participants, and we are very happy to have you today. For number one, our guest speaker, Dr. Leisman, is my friend, is my partner in crime, but his most important element or discriminant is that he created the Brain Institute in Israel, in America, and in Cuba. He's a professor of rehabilitation in Haifa University and restorative neurology in Havana. And he has been publishing more than 500 scientific leading papers, and is really an authority in that field. He made a presentation, short presentation, to a group we have, which was the Global Institute for Resilience, GIRA, and we were so amazed by his presentation that we say, you need to do another one, and you need to make it longer. We need, because last time we pressed him with time. This time we say, you take the time you need. We want to be able to listen in detail of all the good things you have to tell us. So, I am Gerard Meyer. I'm a physiopsychologist. I was working before at Carnegie Mellon I was in charge of human factor at Carnegie Mellon University. And I have been asked by University of Tel Aviv to develop a group called Reswell VUCA for the problem of VUCA. Reswell is a group of researchers connected with University of Tel Aviv in, I think now 40 countries, and we are something like 50 researchers. And our own group, which is Reswell VUCA, is working on the syndemic problem of VUCA through different holistic synergies, research, education, metacognition, iconic communication, resonance therapeutic, and many more things, because we have 35 experts in our group from different countries and different specialties. So all the members of Reswell VUCA are also members of the Mental Wellness Society, that also, with Dr. Leisman, have been a co-founder of that organization. But all the members of Reswell VUCA are part of the Mental Wellness Society, who is now composed of 26,000 experts in 74 countries. We are growing at the rate of 3,500 new members every month, and we have over 2 million views for our effort on LinkedIn. We help to advance mental wellness to fully enjoy living, and we are a network of professionals. Came COVID, so we have been created in 2020, basically a week after COVID started, because we realized that life will not be the same. We will not be able to travel, and there was a need for the type of help we can provide. So we created the Mental Wellness Society, and came during COVID. We help to reduce, for example, burnout, because the medical profession in America was the first profession to commit suicide. But all the frontline people were dealing with very difficult conditions, so we were helping them. Then came in 2022, Ukraine. We created a task force. We helped to train psychologists to new methods that we have developed. And we helped to train 1,500 psychologists in Ukraine. Came Israel, the war in Israel. Now we are involved also in what happened in Israel, and we are trying to bring the best that we know to help the situation with people in distress. So VUCA is VUCAH, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and hyperconnectivity. And there is physiological and psychological consequence of VUCA because they have a compound effect and they are combined together. It's not coming in a state of isolation. They come all together. So they are a syndemic phenomenon because it's a pandemic, but it's different pandemic together. So it's a syndemic definition. On VUCA are the characteristics of the present modern world that affect how health issues unfold and interact. So what is a VUCA? So in our group, we are doing research, innovation, collaborative partnership, education, inclusivity, and ethical and sustainable solution, impact advocacy, and we are helping positive parenting communication. We have 9 groups. Each group is specialized, and we go, for example, I've seen Manana was here. Manana is working on creating the language of resilience. Dr. Leisman is involved in brain and neuroscience, but we have also education. We have validating new technology. We have corporate resilience. We have strategic societal communication. We have health and wellness, and we are looking for somebody to help us, if you are interested, for new economical model in VUCA world, because VUCA have completely destroyed all the former economic model. Nobody knows in economic how to adapt to the problem of VUCA. So VUCA was created in 1987 by the US Army War College in America when the nuke from Russia were directed to United States, let's say 40 miles, about 40 miles from Florida. And then they came up with a concept that life will not be the same anymore because there was a threat, because there was a feeling of vulnerability, uncertainty. It was very concerning, and it was a very uncertain, volatile situation. But the H was not yet there in 1967. It was just VUCA. So basically, what do you want to do to avoid VUCA or VUCH is you want to keep your internal locus of control. And you want to be able to see that you have a binary choice. When you don't see a choice and you see only one way to go, one way to do, you are already dysfunctional. And it's what happened to people who have a PTSD, who have a trauma. A lot of people lose the external locus of control. They end up to have the problem that Dr. Leisman will be talking about. So there is also education and training for VUCA. So there is curriculum now for 6 to 9, 10 to 13, 18 to 23 soon, but there is education program for teachers, and the teachers are training the children. So there are multimedia teacher resilience education for children, and it's interactive. So that's one initiative about education in regard of VUCA. But there is also technology, and there is some technology which have been validated by under Dr. Leisman supervision, and they have been validated for dealing with stress or different conditions, and these have been done by Dr. Leisman. On those type of tools, for example, this one, or this one, or they can be combined, help tremendously because we realize that just to talk is not enough to help to heal people. Talking is not enough. There is a necessity to do more. And we have now technology for that. So that's the type of technology, by the way, which was validated, and you have here the before and after the board intervention. I want to thank also today the Resilience and Wellbeing Foundation, who have been helping to sponsor this event. So I want to thank also all the members of VUCA who are here. But today is the first time that our VUCA group is opening to many other members and other many guests. With that said, I would like Dr. Leisman to now take over the continuation of this webinar.
Oh.
So I should stop share.
There we go. Thank you very much for inviting me, and hopefully I have something to contribute. I should probably make some disclosures before we start. First of which is with the evaluation projects, they were largely done in Cuba. I have no financial interest in it. So that's one disclosure. And the second thing is I would have put a label on what it is that I do. I'm a developmental cognitive neuroscientist, physician once upon a time. But the question is, what am I doing here talking about resilience if my interest really is in human development? The answer is, after we've seen what it is that we've seen, excuse me for a moment. After what we've seen about early human development and how toxic stress can have a profound effect on the long-term development of the human being, it's probably not a bad idea to take a look and see what happens with pregnant women as it relates to stress and how it affects the cognitive capacities of the unborn fetus and penultimately the developing child. But if you're looking at the issue of development already, well, when does something suddenly change in development? The answer is it doesn't, which means that whatever it is that's going on early in childhood has a profound and long-term effect in whatever we see going into the adult years and penultimately towards the end of life. So early childhood experiences have a significant effect on we adults and the development of our nervous systems, and also in how it is that we handle life itself. By the way, the background picture here is university, my university. You're cordially invited to attend, and I promise you I'll give you the Cook's tour. That having been said, let's move on. Hold on one moment. Okay, Gerard has spoken about a number of principles or elements, VUCA plus H, that includes volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. We're going to be talking about these at length in a whole lot more detail, but just simply to set the stage, let's see what we can do. We're going to bifurcate the description between psychological and physiological effects. One might think that psychological and physiological effects are two distinct systems. They're not. Everything has a biological imprint. And so I'm doing this and organizing it in this way as a matter of convenience, intellectual and cognitive convenience, rather than anything physiological. For example, if you get anxious, you don't think it has a physiological effect? Of course it does. What happens is the sympathetic nervous system increases. So you have increases in heart rate, blood pressure, fibrinogen level, that is blood clotting factor, sweating, increases in substances such as adrenal corticotrophic hormone, ACTH, which is an immune suppressant. So if we're going to be talking about the psychological effects of stress, stressors, and what makes an individual resilient, you really cannot bifurcate the psychological piece from the physiological piece. They're actually the same. So let's take a look at each of these concepts one at a time. One is the notion of volatility, and we'll get into details later. And volatility is describable psychologically in terms of chronic anxiety, difficulty concentrating, restlessness, irritability. You can kind of see these effects, these behaviors in attention deficit types of problems. I didn't say disorder, I said types of problems. And as we had just indicated, it's highly associated with sympathetic responses like increased heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory quotient, and so on. I might also add that resilience has something to do with the adaptability of the organism. One of the interesting ways of measuring all of this, and we'll speak about this later on in our chat, is through something that we call heart rate variability. If I were to walk 300 meters to my local shops, my heart rate, assuming that I'm not autistic, some people might disagree with that. However, my heart rate will be variable. Typically in autistics, we don't see that sort of thing. It's that variability. It's the ability to behave differently under different circumstances that creates a piece of what we call resilience, which is the ability to behave adaptively. So one can actually define intelligent behavior in terms of one's capacity to behave adaptively. The more rigid one is, the more incapable one is of being able to behave adaptively in different circumstances, the less resilient you are. And that's an algorithm that we can probably, we can certainly justify. The second piece of what we're talking about is uncertainty. In behavioral terms, anxiety and a sense of powerlessness is associated with uncertainty. We may find it challenging to make decisions or plan for the future. In fact, with obsessive compulsive disorder or behaviors of that ilk, one of the big problems that so many people have is with those kinds of problems is the inability to make effective decisions. So decision-making is very, very much part of this thing. It would be like my saying, I have one of my children lives in Boston. If like saying in the wintertime, if Dan, my son, is walking over a frozen over lake, and somebody yells out, "Hey, the ice is thin," what is the human being likely to do? Are they going to walk forward? Are they going to go backward? The answer succinctly is probably nothing. You'd probably freeze in your tracks, literally, which is going to increase the likelihood of your going through the ice because the coefficient of friction, the heat generated from your standing there, is more likely to crack the ice as opposed to movement. So movement has a lot to do with our ability to getting out of trouble. And it's one of the reasons that the good Lord in her infinite wisdom has actually placed the ability for us to pre-plan movements in the frontal lobes, which is an area of the brain that's concerned with decision-making. And the decision-making is obvious, which is, do you move forward? Do you move backward? Do you run? Do you go away? Am I in danger? Am I going to die? Or am I going to survive this mess? And that decision has physiological consequences. And those physiological consequences, I repeat again, include sympathetic responses. And when you are in a prolonged state of uncertainty, that prolonged state of nervous system activation, sympathetic activation, will remain for a while, and the parasympathetic system will kick in to attempt to stop some of these systems one step at a time. But what will remain will be the body's ability to get the hero, like a deus ex machina in the Greek tragedies, to get the hero off the stage. And how does that happen? You get sick. Well, just like what grandma used to say, that if you walk out in the wintertime without a coat, you'll catch a cold. Well, how is that possible? It's not, because we all know that infection is a factor of fungal invasion or bacterial invasion or viral invasion. How does not wearing a coat in the wintertime have an effect on the ability to fight off disease? And the answer is simply, when you are stressed, and we'll talk about stress in a moment, when you are stressed, there's an increase in adrenal corticotrophic hormone, ACTH, which is also an immunosuppressant. And as a consequence of that, you're more likely to get sick, which is one of the reasons likely that medical staff in hospitals typically don't get sick, while the patients there have a statistically increased likelihood of doing so. So the other issue with uncertainty is we need to be certain about what happens in life. And the greater the uncertainty, the greater the likelihood for anxiety. And the greater the likelihood for anxiety, the greater the likelihood for these physiological so-called emergency reactions that we're talking about. The other matter with uncertainty is, and all of the things that allow us to reduce that uncertainty, including obsessive behavior, is we are not built for uncertainty. We're built to avoid danger. And if there is danger ongoing or the possibility of danger, the likelihood of these sympathetic systems tripping off is significantly increased. So our job then, as human beings, in fact, as organisms, is to be as certain as we can, to automate as much of behavior as we possibly can. It's the automation of behavior that's a direct consequence of early child development. We're trying to automate as much as we can so that we don't have to think about it. If you had to think about avoiding an accident in a car because someone sideswipes you by a couple of centimeters, you're going to wind up in an accident. But if you reactive immediately without thinking about it, then your likelihood of avoiding that accident is increased, meaning that you're less likely to get into an accident. Then the emergency reactions kick in. So it's after you've avoided the accident that, oh my God, I avoided an accident. And then these reactions that we're talking about kick in. One of the problems with terrorism, for example, here in Israel, there's roughly about 360 plus minus vehicular deaths per year, deaths associated with car accidents. I think there's, until this recent war, I think the average is something like about 20 or something like that. It's relatively low. Yet what's the problem with terrorism? The terrorism problem is very simple. It's the uncertainty. It's you don't know when it's going to happen, where it's going to happen, and if it's going to be you. Whereas you're in control of your own car. Next issue, before we get into the meat of matters, is complexity. And that's got something to do with cognitive overload, exhaustion, burnout, difficulty prioritizing tasks, maintaining focus. That's all associated with task complexity. Physiologically, we see this kind of thing in terms of chronic fatigue, disrupted sleep, increased susceptibility to illness. And finally, there's the issue of ambiguity. And behaviorally, we see confusion, indecision, lack of clarity, heightened stress and frustration. And that impacts, generally speaking, human behavior. And physiologically, we see increases, as we've indicated before, increases in stress hormone, cortisol, which affects metabolism, immune function, the cardiovascular function, diet, and many, many other things of that ilk. Let me move us ahead for some reason. There we go. In this particular slide, when I talk about uncertainty, I don't necessarily mean physical uncertainty. I mean all of it. So here we have a slide of activation patterns and in the bilateral insula in response to certain versus uncertain trials. And here we can clearly see significant differences between certainty and uncertainty, certain and uncertain conditions. Second. What we can also see, without delving into the neuroanatomy in any great detail, is the fact that when we are dealing with the estimates of threat, the cost of threat and probability, or versus uncertainty, the actual pathways that are involved in ambiguity and threat are very different than under normal circumstances. And our capacity to handle threat can actually be observed and studied by looking at the differences of these networks that develop. If you remember from your psychologist, Psych 1, your physicians, when you took neuroanatomy way back when, we spoke about areas of Brodmann, like areas 8 and 9 being associated with frontal eye fields, and 18 and 19 with occipital eye fields, areas of Brodmann associated with expressive language. It doesn't work. It doesn't work that way in the main. In fact, if a neurosurgeon is doing surgery, they will keep the patient under local anesthesia to make sure they're in the right place, because the nervous system is not organized on the basis of anatomy. It's organized on the basis of functional connectivities. And we're seeing that actually in this kind of slide. What happens developmentally in this case is we go from early childhood into adulthood, from the development of small into large world networks. And here they're diagrammed pretty clearly. So for example, if someone asks a child a question, depending upon whether the words are face related or leg related, will determine what that network looks like. The whole left hemisphere will be involved, but it will not involve the entire brain. The older we get and the more we learn, and I'll explain what I mean by this in a moment, the more we learn, the older we get, the more the brain develops, the more we automate. So for example, and I promise I will leave this piece of this alone in a moment once I've made my major point. There's a condition called Rasmussen syndrome. The treatment for Rasmussen's, which is associated with uncontrollable seizures, roughly about by the age of about 3 developmentally. The effective treatment for that is hemispherectomy, where surgeons will remove half the brain of a child. And that child, not 100%, but that child in the main will be an effective learner, will be able to move, will be a relatively normal human being. You do the same thing in an adult and you're going to have a major problem. And so there's a fundamental difference in the systems that we're talking about between early childhood and adulthood. And remember, what's underneath, what's driving this is the ability to automate as much as we possibly can, which is to not concentrate, to not have to make a decision, to not think. And that's where the issue of uncertainty comes in. When we are uncertain, we don't know how to think. We don't know how to respond. And that's the reason, particularly, why the premotor cortex and the supplementary motor areas are in the frontal lobes associated with decision-making so that you can move if danger is coming your way. What happens over early childhood into later childhood and adolescence is the small world networks become large world networks, which means more brain is involved. So for example, I speak multiple languages, all of them from childhood. I can't learn a new language for the love of God. I tried Mandarin, didn't work. I tried Russian, hell, it didn't work. Then my German, a little bit better, but not by much. But how do I speak the languages that I do? And the answer is they're all from early childhood. And that speaks to this issue of small versus large world networks. So let's take a look at some neuroanatomical principles, and then I think we can really fly with what it is that I want to talk about today. So in this area over here, we have histologies of neural connectivities of a 5-day-old infant, a 6-year-old infant, and an adult. We can see, hopefully we can see, that the connectivities of an adult are more akin to the 5-day-old infant in terms of connectivities than they are to the 6-year-old. The 6-year-old has exuberant connectivities because that kid is learning what to automate. He's learning, or she's learning, that certain sounds doesn't appear in English, Hebrew, French, Spanish, German, but does in certain African languages. We don't need it. Because we don't need it, we pare it out, it goes away. So we learn to build networks, and you're looking at how that happens histologically. So now we can start talking about the rest of the world and how it affects us and what our bodies can do about it. So we still have not defined stress, and I will get to that. But chronic stress leads to dendritic shrinkage, which means your capacity to make new dendritic connections will be significantly reduced the greater the degree of stress that a developing individual undergoes. In fact, I can say that it's not only the developing individual, the same issue may happen with new learning in an adult after toxic stress over prolonged periods of time. Here we can see from the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard University, that this would be an example of normal dendritic linkages, and this would be an example of the effect of toxic stress where we see fewer connections in young children as a consequence, a direct consequence of stress. So going back to the issue of behavioral sciences, there aren't many laws in the behavioral sciences, but there are a few. And one of them is termed the Yerkes-Dodson law, the so-called bell curve, which represents arousal as a function of performance as a function of arousal. One might think that it's a great idea to relax, and you think you might be able to learn better that way. The answer, according to Yerkes-Dodson, is absolutely not. And you might think that no stress is the appropriate thing. No. What we can say is that in order for us to perform optimally, one needs an optimum amount of stress, and we still haven't defined stress. The more stress level increases, the greater the stress level increases, the lower the performance. And here we can see this tapering off, and we can say the same thing in the other direction. The less stress you have from this midpoint area, the weaker your performance will become, independent of the task. So let's put this into another context, the Yerkes-Dodson, in terms of the level of stress, and we still haven't defined stress, but I'm getting there. So boredom decreases performance. Engage somewhat is have a comfort zone here, but it doesn't maximize performance. We have a growth and learning zone, which is optimal performance. And this is what teachers ought to be dealing with. Also, what we should be dealing with as parents. You want to have your kids succeed? Don't keep them here, and certainly don't keep them there. Don't take your children to a museum every weekend and have them write reports at home. That's not the function of home. That may actually be the function of school. Maybe, maybe not, but it's surely not of home. You don't need that anxiety, panic, anger, break, and those kinds of things going on at home. What we're shooting for is moderate levels of stress. So here come our definitions. What's resilience? It's our ability, it's the human ability to cope with setbacks, trauma, adverse reactions, and so on. I need to move this. Being resilient is necessary for workplace well-being. And a particular misconception about resilience is that it's definitely not that you won't experience any difficulties. It's got nothing to do with difficulties of life. Rather, resilience refers to how one manages difficulties skillfully and successfully. Resilience helps one's personal growth and gives better and newer perspectives on life. Now we're going to get to the issue of the definition of stress, and then I think we can fly. Hopefully, we'll fly. There was this guy named Selye who worked at McGill University, originally from Hungary. Most of his work was in the 50s and 60s. And he defined a stressor, did not say stress, a stressor, as anything perceived by the organism as being physically and or psychologically injurious to it. I repeat, his definition of stress was anything perceived by the organism as being physically and or psychologically injurious to it. And I go back to my original comment from when we started this afternoon, which is perception, that is the psychological piece, the cognitive piece, is as toxic, potentially toxic, as physical stress, as hard work, as backbreaking work. It's the same thing because it has the same effect on the body. So psychological threat, uncertainty, and physical threat, someone pointing a gun or a knife at somebody, has the same effect. But that is not stress. That's a stressor. Now, why is there a difference between stressor and stress, and we haven't defined it yet? Part of it we did, is because we are very resilient organisms. We are built for adaptability. In evolutionary terms, we're adaptive organisms. And we're intelligent organisms. If the closer we are to the OCD spectrum, the less intelligent we are, because the less adaptable we are in that definition of intelligence. So Selye went on and defined stress as anything that's perceived by the organism as being physically and or psychologically injurious to it over prolonged periods of time. Critical piece to his theory, which basically holds up, which is I can have an argument with my kid, my wife, my friends, my students, and we'll get over it. But if I come home every day to toxic stress, where dishes are getting thrown, where there are arguments all the time, and that happens on a daily basis over prolonged periods of time, or I have a job and a boss that I can't stand, or if I'm sexually harassed on the job, or if I am in a situation, no matter what the particular example might be, that I perceive, it's not necessarily that anyone perceives it, that I perceive as toxic stress to me over prolonged periods of time, then the emergency reactions will kick in. There will be an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, fibrinogen level, blood sugar level, respiratory quotient, and so on. And what will happen is we will get sick. When we get sick, unless you're really dumb, we're going to wind up in bed. We have a mechanism, a deus ex machina, to get us out of the situation. We'll wind up in bed. Sorry, I couldn't come to work today. I have a fever, 3, 4, 5 days out. And we're good about it. Take a look at being in a toxic relationship during COVID-19. Not fun. I know a not insignificant number of people whose marriages fell apart. Well, they probably would have fallen apart anyway at some point in time, but they certainly did because they were in close proximities in a very toxic relationship over prolonged periods of time. So, resilience, where I'm taking this is resilience has a lot to do with what we call neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity, in very simple parlance, is the ability to behave adaptively, but it's permanently implanted in the brain and nervous system. So historically, when there was a limited awareness about mental health, it was thought that all human behaviors were innate, were biologically driven, and there were no ways to control those behaviors. So if a person was not resilient, there was no way to develop that. There was no way to develop resilience. But now we know that through neuroplastic changes, through the ability to develop networks in the brain that we can now measure, examples of which you saw with the histologies I had put up before. So now we know that through neuroplasticity, resilience can be achieved. And neuroplasticity, that's at any age in life. So neuroplasticity is how one's brain is trainable to change its neural networks by growth and reorganization. And these synaptic connections can be resynced by learning and rigorous training. It had been thought in the past that once we get to my age, I'm not voting about anyone else in here, but I'm apparently ancient, new learning was very difficult. Well, to some extent, it's difficult only because we require more trials to acquisition of a skill. However, we're capable of learning throughout life, and we're capable of relearning, but relearning is very difficult. That would be, I have a musical background. That would be like me teaching someone how to play the violin after they've learned how to play the violin themselves, they think. And how to undo those fingering movements is really difficult. Not impossible, but really difficult because we automate as much of the human behavior as possible. So what we now can do is talk about those brain structures that are involved in neuroplasticity that in turn are associated with resilience. Resilience comes pretty much through a singular method, and that's practice. And resilience helps us to shape synaptic connections. And there's an area of the brain where that happens, and that area is called the amygdala. And the amygdala is part of the brain that's most responsive to emotional behavior. It's that part of the brain that's tripped off first in teenagers. It's that part of the brain that for those of you who have teenagers or young men under the age of 26 or young females under the age of 23, when you want to buy car insurance for them, you will pay through the nose because the actuaries and insurance companies know that the frontal lobes connectivities have not fully developed yet, but the amygdala is working just fine. So the decisions, sometimes stupid decisions, are made that we see in teenagers are very much amygdala-based. So the amygdala is that part of the brain most responsive to emotional behavior. Any kind of emotional behavior is triggered by the amygdala, and the neurons which extend from the amygdala are triggered principally by fear and stress. Resilience, on the other hand, involves mechanisms that promote human adaptive behavior, that promote intelligent behavior, and that promote flexible adaptation to change. The difficulty or the inability to change is a lack of resilience. So now we know something about stressors. They happen all the time. Somebody pisses me off. Okay, I'm sorry now, I apologize, on we go. But someone is upsetting me on an ongoing basis. That's very stressful. And I need to speak to them about that so we can reconcile or not, as the case may be. Resilience then implicates plasticity from the get-go. So resilience involves the mechanisms that promote flexible adaptation to change, resourceful use of contextual provisions in the service of personal growth, and the capacity to persist towards long-term goals tempered by an ability to modify and recalibrate. That is, resilience implies neuroplasticity. Plasticity is based on neurobiological systems that are underlying social fitness, physical stamina, endurance as individuals flexibly adapt to diverse conditions. Therefore, those individuals who are on the autistic spectrum are not neurodiverse, and you can't look at them that way. They're a lot resilient, and they're going to have troubles adapting to life. So resilience implies neuroplasticity, the ability to make new connections, the ability to use large world networks, the terms that we've described up to and including this point. Bonding is the process of exuding the greatest plasticity in mammals. And by bonding, I mean mother-child. I don't believe I just said that, but I did say that because I used to think that guys can do this as well as women. But mea culpa, I'm like profoundly wrong. And we may actually talk about why, or maybe we'll save that for another time. A great neuroplasticity has led to the evolution of what we call viviparity, which is internal gestation, and to physiological reorganization in mother and young, and their young, that enable the maturation of the fetus inside the maternal body. Halfway there would be something like a kangaroo, a marsupial. Egg laying, except for the egg-laying mammal, one, platypus. But egg-laying organisms have less bonding with their offspring. If you take a look at birds, they have a high encephalization index. They're actually bipedal. Bipedalism has a lot to do with this. This is not the forum for talking about evolutionary issues, but it has a lot to do with this. So great neuroplasticity led to viviparity and to physiological reorganization in mother and young that enabled the maturation of the fetus within the maternal body. And huge neuroplasticity is required to make the newborn the most salient object to its mother, to the exclusion of all other foci. I can give examples, obvious examples from humans, but we can also talk about the fact that rats, for example, pregnant rats generate prolactin. Prolactin is associated with nest-building behavior. I can inject prolactin into a non-pregnant rat, and they'll start nest-building behavior. So we already have models, many metabolic and physiological models for this kind of connection in bonding, but it also works socially and psychologically. Oxytocin system plays a key role in neuroplasticity, which is critical to the formation of attachments. And the period after childbirth marks the time of greatest plasticity in the adult brain. In other words, whatever's happening in our adult brain has consequential to what was going on in early childhood. And maybe Freud was right to some extent, to a large extent actually, when he was talking about the effect of early childhood experiences and how they parlay out later on in life. So the plasticity component of resilience has two components to it. One is it's integrative and regulatory, and that means that it speaks to our ability to automate behavior. One, and that it's regulatory in nature, and that it involves the entire nervous system. So it's integrative, large world networks, and it's regulatory. It's involved with time. Remember, we spoke about Selye, and he defined stress as anything that's perceived by the organism as being physically and or psychologically injurious to it over prolonged periods of time. So regulation, neural regulation, the timing of it is critical. That's got something to do with movement and cognitive function and how they link in with it also. But it also has a lot to do with resilience. And so the principal issue here is that it's regulatory and time-based. Regulation and temporal coding promote flexible integration of the system components, these large world networks, into a functional whole. It shapes the self. It shapes individuality, agency, movement in a certain direction, well-being through the formation of new person-specific dyad, that's two people, dyad-specific and culture-specific configurations. And much developmental research has been directed to the construct of regulation. So resilience and regulation connect. Regulation adopts a systems perspective. Instead of talking about this brain area versus that brain area, we need to really talk about these large world networks again. And it describes how components of a system actually merge together into a functional whole, how higher and lower elements organize over time, and how components from within the system integrate with those in the immediate environment. In very plain English, what we're talking about is a nervous system that allows us to have effective interaction with the environment in which we're in. Our sensory systems are built for that. That is why we see, we hear, we feel, we touch, we have temperature, hot, cold, proprioception. Oh, by the way, there are more than 5 senses, as you've already heard. I think I just got to 8. There are 28, at least, probably more. The issue of 5 senses is from some teacher in high school, but nothing to do with reality. And regulatory processes mature on top of each other. This is the top-downs on top of each other, from biological to emotional to attentional to self-regulatory. Parent-child co-regulation, what we call synchrony, supports maturation of higher-order regulatory skills, such as attention modulation and self-control. It's the interaction, it's the bonding between parents and child that has a lot to do with the capacity for resilience. Guess who's got a lot to do with training of all of this? That's why we want to do resilience training. You better start getting it done while mama's pregnant. So resilience is a time-bound and process-based system developing from simple to complex and from biological to mental. The timeless component of resilience is critical, not only across evolution, from infancy to childhood, but also at the level of concrete social experiences. Social moments unfold in time when 2 or more participants create a novel dance of matched and mismatched moments that coordinate behavior, physiology, and mental states. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this and why movement is so critical to this as well. There's a guy named W.S. Condon. He worked in the Boston area in the 1960s and published some fundamentally interesting things that for some reason or another doesn't have much traction. What he did was he looked at kids in a playground. He was looking at synchrony in children. He also looked at it in adults. And he found that this is before the time of digital imaging. Excuse me. He looked at children in the playground, did video films of them, did a frame-by-frame analysis of those video films, and found that the change in movement was roughly 5 hertz, 5 changes per second. By the way, the standing cortical rhythm of a child is about 5 hertz. It's about 5 cycles per second. An adult is 10 cycles per second, and the alpha rhythm explains that. But these kids were in phase relationship with each other. That is, the ones that were opposite each other moved in 180 degrees opposite to each other, but at the same time. So there's something that linked them motorically and electrophysiologically as well. That he measured with video, and it's been subsequently measured physiologically in applications as diverse as bonding to the Japanese art of swordsmanship called toate. So this stuff has been around. But this issue of synchrony between people is what is stress reducing. If you take a look at army guys, for example, going into battle, and we've had some experience with that here, there's a lot of yay team, there's a lot of yelling and screaming to really cook the juices up. Well, I don't know, it's about whether it's cooking testosterone, but it's certainly more to do with synchrony within the groups. And the synchrony is an important issue that is involved in the building of these networks that we're talking about. One second. Here we go. Okay. E.O. Wilson, a sociobiologist, had a text called The Social Conquest of Earth, and he argued that humans achieve supremacy among vertebrates and ants among invertebrates because of their eusociality, their hypersociality. which involves the capacity for collaborative action among group members and social organizations across generations. I'm going to repeat this. The basis of effective resilience and effective living is hypersociality. It's the ability of people to work in groups. The more isolated you are, the less likely you are to sustain stress, as Selye defines it, over prolonged periods of time. It's one of the issues that's underneath burnout, whatever that may be. It's certainly another issue that's underneath PTSD. It's the solo versus the group cohesion piece. And that's very, very much part of this. And there's a lot of data, a lot of literature and theory to support this particular notion. Primitive mechanisms of synchrony can be found in ants. I have no idea how they do what they do. Fish, birds, and all are underpinned by coordinating biology and behavior through vasotocin. And the parent molecule of the which is the parent molecule of the mammalian oxytocin and vasopressin. Humans' biobehavioral synchrony, therefore, depends on a history of social mechanisms that promote resilience via action coordination and the release of these particular hormones. While the first two tenets of, by the way, a hormone is a substance released in one place in the body that has an effect on another place in the body. So if we're interested in dealing with the whole body, you need to take the endocrine system very seriously. So while the first two tenets of resilience build on species' general foundations and add a human dimension to them, the meaning-making element is exclusively human. We're the guys who supposedly think that meaning is important. By the way, meaning doesn't necessarily have to exist. We think our ability to think that there's meaning in life is really what we're after. I personally don't think there's anything meaning in life other than to promote fertile offspring. I think that's God's great joke. That Viktor Frankl, it gets to be write 72 books on the meaning of life, and I don't think it's there. Other than to produce fertile offspring and maintain your culture and make sure your DNA is passed on to the next generation. And I'm a very religious guy, but I actually think this is in fact the case. So what's exclusively human is endurance, diversity, adaptation. By diversity, I don't mean what's going on now politically in the world. Diversity, adaptation, stress management within the human's ability to give meaning to hardship, adversity, and trauma. There was a study done by Schachter and Singer going back to the 70s, I think, at Yale. Not my favorite place these days, in which he had divided a group. I just editorialized, I'm sorry. Actually, I'm not. Where he divided a group in two, and half were deliberately informed, and the other half were deliberately misinformed about the effects of norepinephrine on their autonomic responses, on the ability to perceive stress. They were given injections. So half of the subjects, of the participants, were told that they were given a performance-enhancing drug, and the other half were told that it was going to affect their autonomic nervous systems. Without getting into details of the experiment, the ones that were appropriate and informed about the effect of the drugs largely attributed the physiological reactions to the drug. And the ones that were deliberately misinformed about the effects of the drug attributed their responses to stress, the stress of the experimental situation, which means the physiological responses are essentially irrelevant. What is relevant is how you label those physiological responses. So the labeling piece is another critical issue in how it is that we understand the notion of human resilience. That is, if you got a good story underneath it, that's what psychotherapy is about. Psychotherapy is about, give me a good story. Tell me why I'm doing whatever it is that I'm doing. It doesn't have to be accurate. It doesn't even have to be real. Just need a good story. Oh God, now I understand. Now I feel better. It may be accurate. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Humans' ability to give meaning to trauma utilize.
5 more minutes.
Are you kidding me? I thought I had a free reign with this thing. All right,
Yeah.
all right. So let me zip ahead. Okay, we spoke about oxytocin. Okay, let me get back to this. So the elements of behavioral functions of a healthy mind include awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. If I wanted to really be nasty about it, I'd build a pyramid, just like Maslow did, and then everyone would read my work. But I'm not. Awareness, it is when you're in a state of stress, or when you want to avoid stress, you need to scan your environment. You need to be aware. So, for example, if I was looking at a gorgeous, magnificent painting, or was listening to the Bach B minor Mass, which I enjoy very much, I guarantee you that if something blew up in outside of my house, I wouldn't be listening to the B minor Mass. I would be automatically oriented someplace else. That's what I mean by awareness. You can't control it. Second is connection. Who are you? Where do you come from? Are you part of a group or not? The issue of insight is, so now I understand this. And the other is, okay, I have a sense of purpose. I know I'm doing whatever it is that I'm doing for a purpose. So there are a couple of types of learning. One is declarative learning, which is blah, 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 what we're doing right now. I am being the talking head. And the other is the procedural learning, which is how to. And they're both necessary for transformative human behavior. And the wiring of our brains is not fixed, but it's adaptable across our lifetimes. So this is an example of resilient coping. And here is risky coping. And we can measure the differences between these two dynamics. Here we have emotion regulation involves the influence of the prefrontal cortex over the amygdala. This is what we hope our teenagers can eventually do. And the nucleus accumbens. And there was a study done by Wang who noted that individuals who were taught compassion showed greater dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and nucleus accumbens connectivity, and they were asked to redistribute fake money. They distributed more funds after training, whereas those who were involved with reappraisal, as opposed to emotion regulation, did differently. So we can measure, there are physiological measurement techniques that can actually physically measure the biology of resilience. And they include electromyography, blood volume pulse, breathing rate, that's respiratory rate, skin conductance, peripheral temperature, and we can organize them into a graph, and we can actually plot someone's individual profile physiologically for the capacity to be resilient under stress. That we can also do that behaviorally, but given the fact that I've been asked to stop, so thank you very much for this opportunity. Hopefully I made a difference, and I'll take questions.
Thank you so much for all what you said. Just one question. Importance of sleep.
Of sleep, you said?
Sleep.
Of course. The function of sleep generally is a lot of metabolic issues, but in particular, REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, which is called paradoxical sleep, is involved in the consolidation of memory. So when it is, that's why we dream. Dream is not about some deep, dark, hidden secret. It's about the consolidation of memory traces. So if we learn something and go to sleep immediately after, we will retain it significantly better than if we don't. Even if we learn something, like a list of nonsense words, go to sleep, have 8 hours of waking activity, and then relearn, we will do significantly better than if we don't go to sleep immediately after. So there's a lot of literature that supports that particular issue, but effective learning, and that means unlearning, relearning, is handled best when we sleep immediately after whatever it is that we're trying to learn and unlearn. I might also add there's the issue of situation-specific learning, which is if there's an emotional base to something that you've learned, you need the same emotional base in order to most effectively reproduce it. So for example, if I'm not suggesting that we do this or that our children do this, but if you learn something under the influence of marijuana, then your output should be under the influence of marijuana. That would be most effective way of doing something. That's not a suggestion, it's just a point of explanation. So yeah, sleep certainly enhances our ability to retain information.
Also, I just wanted to indicate that VUCA plus H includes the 4 elements you indicated, plus hyperconnectedness, which came since COVID. And everybody was staying at home, connecting the computer, being on the computer, and it has been shown that the people, despite the fact you will think connecting everybody with a computer, you get better. No, it's an aggravator of the whole 4 factor, and it also diminishes the social capability of the people. And actually, Dr. Leisman might confirm that there is part of the brain which become kind of inactive when you are too much involved in hyperconnectivity, where the computer is making the decision for you and not yourself. If you spend too much time, it disturbs sleep, it disturbs a lot of things. Am I correct, Dr. Leisman?
Yes. In fact, what we're trying to do is to reduce as many extraneous operations, brain operations, as we possibly can, because you need more sugar in order for those operations, more glucose in order for those operations to occur. So we're trying to automate as much as possible, and that area of the brain, of brain processing, that requires as probably the most metabolic expenditure is cognition. So we try to think as little as we possibly can, and I can certainly attest to that on the basis of what we're seeing in the newspapers these days and in the world. Very little thinking is going on, and an awful lot of automated behavior. It's stress reducing to some extent.
Any question? Anybody?
I have one, just to comment, hello, and that's an excellent presentation. Thank you so much. I've learned so much. It's Nerida Saunders from Australia.
Very late in Australia.
Pardon? Very late in Australia.
Very late now in Australia.
Yeah, my croaky voice. What I think to the laying down of memory traces, if there is an emotional event, from what I understand, it can be a much stronger memory. Is that the case, Dr. Leisman?
Absolutely, yes. It's one of the things that ought to be happening in schools, where we should be not dealing with increased difficulty, but rather with increased complexity, but but using multiple channels to get that information. And there's a whole technology underneath this. I don't know if this is the vehicle to deal with that, but we're really talking. But your point is very well taken, because we're really dealing with the same process that's involved in education, stress reduction, resilience training, and that is the ability to automate behavior, to the ability to make effective decisions and to behave adaptively. That's what we're trying to do in school. So yeah,
yeah, yeah,
we have
very
a question
good.
from an anonymous attendee. Could neuroplasticity differ among athletes based on their longitudinal exposure to stress combined with exercise intensity? Consequently, could they be more resilient than the general population? Are these studies comparing this situation? Are there studies comparing that?
Reading the question. Could neuroplasticity differ among athletes based on their longitudinal
Sorry?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, what you're trying to do with an athlete is to have their thinking done up first. The more you think, the less effective you're going to be in the performance of a particular act. So the thinking comes, what is the right angle that I need to have in order to do a broad jump or to do a pole vault? That's where the thinking comes in before you start. But I can answer this better in the following way. We did some experiments 100 years ago with monkeys on a choice reaction time task. And what they needed to do was they had a warning signal, which was a light. And they had 2 lights to the right, 2 lights to the left, or 3 lights to the right and left, respectively, of that warning signal. When the warning signal went on, they would then had X number of seconds to either move right or move left, and they didn't know where the signal was coming from next, and then move to push a button to turn off the light. I don't know if that makes any sense, but and we recorded brain activity during the entire task. When the monkey moved its arm, the prefrontal cortex was silent. There's no activity. Brain's not interested in working where it doesn't need to work. All of the effort was done in motor planning, in the pre-planning of the movement. So with sport, it's the same thing. It's how am I going to do this? What movements can I practice in order to automate it? But the actual performance is automated. And it's the same thing with pretty much every aspect of human behavior, including resilience. How do you put yourself in a situation and automate as much as you can so you don't need to think about what it is that the consequences of what you're doing? You've already thought about it. That's also how we get out of problems where we didn't think about it and we wound up in trouble. That's for another time.
Also, the sport people can process information in a short time. So they have the capability to take more information in a shorter time. So they are less stressed by the information itself, but they are conditioned to do the movement. Any other question?
There's a question from one of our attendees, Elena Godley. I'll allow her to talk.
Okay. You mean Saravia? Elena. Madalena Ferreira?
No, Elena Godley, because she raised her hand earlier.
Hi, sorry. Hi, it's Ilana here. I don't think I had a question. I think I maybe raised my hand, but thank you for the presentation. Really interesting. I'd like to connect with Professor Leisman outside of this because of the work that I'm doing with an AMOTA called Emotional Aid on resilience. So thank you. Sorry.
Okay. Are there, Yamit Sarabia, are there any ways to aid the mother-child bond in adults who unfortunately did not experience it at the appropriate stage of development?
Oy. That's a tough one, but I'll try. First thing that comes to mind is the Romanian orphanages during the time of Ceausescu, and when he got killed and Romania became what it is right now, these kids were left with profound brain damage as a result of lack of exposure. It actually goes back to some interesting work from the late 1940s, early 50s, from a guy named René Spitz, who was brought in to evaluate something called marasmus or institutionalization at New York Foundling Hospital. The guy who brought him in was a fellow named Dr. Fontana. What he found was that roughly about 15% of the babies who were there over the first couple of years of life, over the 15 months of life, withered away and died, had failure to thrive. That statistic was way, way higher than it ought to have been. And he tried to figure out what it is that could affect the infant's development. And what he found was one thing. Instead of the staff covering up the cribs with blankets to reduce crying and fidgety behavior, the staff just a couple of times a day would pick up the infant, just pick them up. And the tactile contact was enough to reduce the marasmus of the institutionalization rate from roughly 15 to about 2%, which is certainly within normal limits. I was item 1. He got this bright idea after that study to take children out of New York Foundling Hospital and put them into an institution for mentally retarded women adults. He figured this way. In the Foundling Hospital, they're not doing anything. In an institution for mentally retarded women adults, they're not doing it. These women aren't doing anything either, but they're certainly more intelligent than the 1-year-old infant or a half-a-year-old infant, and they'd love to take care of them. What they found was that there was something, I'm not sure the exact numbers, but I do believe it's something like about a 20-point IQ spread after 2 years between those that were left in the institution versus those that were not. What does this tell us? It tells us that certain things are laid down early, and they're called sensitive or critical periods. It used to be thought that there were a lot more critical periods than there actually are. But there are some things that really are critical. Let's call them sensitive periods so we can avoid that argument. Which is, if you have a child who used to be born with congenital cataracts and they were operated on later on in life, for whatever the reason may be, and not getting into medical practice issues, and that child in kindergarten learned how to distinguish haptically, touch, the difference between a triangle, square, and a circle. And if that child regained their sight at the age of 6, 7, 8, whatever it might be, maybe couldn't accommodate, but with glasses would see reasonably normal. If they were asked to discriminate between a circle, square, and a triangle, they would not be able to do it visually. They need to be able to do that haptically, by touch. They would see it, they would draw it out. So there's some things that are laid down very early that are very difficult to break. It's back to that violin example. If you're teaching someone who's learned how to play the violin on their own, how to play properly, you're going to have to relearn that thing. It's really, really difficult. So the answer to the question, I guess, is
Thank you.
Once there's abuse developmentally, it's not the same thing with adults. But once there's abuse developmentally, the likelihood is that the consequences of that abuse will continue. The object is how to be most effective at avoiding those kind of consequences developmentally.
Last question. It's from Shirin Kulkami. Does creativity play a role in resilience? You will like that one.
Oh, yeah, of course. Creativity is the ability to behave adaptively. And adaptive behavior is what we're trying to pull off with resilience. That is, we're trying to create intelligent human beings. The best way to do that is, oh, by the way, the school systems, most of the school systems in the world teach to the left hemisphere. They teach to blah, 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 talking heads. Sit in the classroom, fold your hands, and there you go. That doesn't inspire great creativity, and as a consequence, probably not great resilience either. So there you go.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. The recording will be on the Reswell website. If you have any question, you can write me an email. It will be wonderful. And we will contact you when we have another event. And please send us news about what you think of the event or some suggestion, remarks, questions, and we'll be happy to engage with you. That's what we are here for. Thank you so much, everybody.
And one other thing, if anyone wants to get in touch with me directly about this or anything else, happily, absolutely happily. And you can look me up online. I think my email address, probably in Google Scholar, you can get my email address, but it's all over the place. So waiting to hear from you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.